Welcome to the Latin Playground, where we delve into the nature of language, the nuances of NeoLatin, and the spiritual experiences of the scientist and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Never heard of NeoLatin or Swedenborg? No problem. Come learn alongside us as we explore the inextricable link between spiritual revelation and grammar. This is our first ever Latin playground, and we have no idea quite what that means. But what we do know is we're all here with a shared passion for Latin, and specifically Swedenborg's NeoLatin, and an interest in language and translation. I want to say that we have Dr. Jonathan Rose here, series editor of the New Century Edition translation of Swedenborg's theological works.
Great pleasure.
Yes, and Ray Schneider, our metadata specialist at the Swedenborg Foundation, but also Latin enthusiast. Mm-hmm. And then we've got Felicia Chavez, publishing coordinator for the Swedenborg Foundation, as well as Latin enthusiast. And Cardam, Latin consultant and moderator for Off the Left Eye. And somebody with lots of Latin history. And then me, Chelsea Odner, Vice President of Publishing at the Swedenborg Foundation, and Latin enthusiast. I don't know if you'd call me a Latin enthusiast, an appreciator of Latin, and Swedenborg enthusiast. And I am recording this with the possibility that these recorded Latin playground things could be used to produce a podcast that could be about Latin, and really using the Latin as a springboard for exploring Swedenborg's ideas and getting into the nuance of what's involved in translation. So, and even like on a big grand scale, you have like spiritual ideas. You know, what does that even mean? Getting put into words in this not used language anymore called NeoLatin, very specific period of Latin, and then being translated into English so that we as the Swedenborg Foundation then publish those books or publish books that engage with those ideas, all to try to like go back to that spiritual level of what even is that concept? How is it alive in you? Why is this stirring to us? You know, what stirs our souls? And so that language and words are such a big part of soul stirring that we are exploring that here. So it's like a pretty big cosmic thing that we're doing, even though like in Jonathan's world and your world, Cara, when you've worked on it, is like, you're just looking at little letters and what letters match this and match that. And well, it could be this or it could say that. It's just like almost mind-bending how much of a contrast there is of those two things, and yet they're so necessary to each other to even this, you know. And I, for one, who read older translations of Swedenborg's books and then read the New Century Edition, there's a noticeable difference. Like, you can't deny the difference in quality, in a sense of like openness. Like suddenly it's generating thoughts in my mind that before my mind's like struggling to put together, well, what is this really even saying? Whereas there's this like free transmission of ideas or something, and that's because there was this care that was done in the language, in putting the words together and thinking about what is Swedenborg trying to convey and everything. So I don't quite know what we're going to do today, but I will complete my introduction there and pass the mic to Jonathan.
Yeah. I don't know quite what's happening either, but I've prepared some thoughts, and I've prepared a passage that we could look at. I'm also very, very interested in particularly Ray and Felicia's any thoughts that you have or things that you need. Maybe there are questions that you already have. And so I don't know quite whether to start with those questions. Maybe what we should start with is just to ask everybody to say something brief about what you imagine, or you know, what's a need that you have that would be fun if this could meet it. And then I'll launch into some more sort of thoughts about language, and then we'll get into a passage and look at it. That's what I'm thinking roughly we might do. Maybe I'll start because that's supposed to be fair with sharing, right? The,
You started it.
I have had a longing for a long time to just, I've had this mental image for decades now of just sitting down with people and we cracked a book and we're looking at the book together. And part of the origin of this was that when I was in grad school, a teacher of mine named Greg Dickerson taught us Greek tragedy, and Greek, that Attic Greek and everything, it was not easy for me. I didn't have a background in it. And so I would look at it and it would be kind of opaque, this classical Greek. But when he would read it, he would go, you see, eta, chi, omega, that's echo, that's echo. That's the word we know as echo. Oh, all of a sudden the lights go on. I can see the word echo right there, you know, and because he can see it, it's almost like I can get a, I'm on his Wi-Fi briefly where I can get what he understands about language. And I've wanted to do that for people, not out of any arrogance or anything, but just like that was so fun for me. And so I think it'd be fun to look at something together. One thing that I would love would be to just share an enjoyment, share a passion and information as well. That's something I'm looking for from these sessions. And I think it's a really fun idea. Another background thing I'll say quickly as I can is that in my view, Latin has been in decline for some 2,000 years. It's not likely to be on the increase. There may be upswings in certain areas right now, but I think it's quite likely that it will become rarer and rarer that people know it. And I think it'll be important for the Swedenborg Foundation of the future to maybe be doing some Latin education of its own if it can't get that supplied by other sources or something. Not that we know everything, but with this team of translators, we've built up a lot of information over the last, really a century of translator time, like 4 translators working for 25 years. And so not wanting to lose that information, but pass on some things and inspire the next generation to go farther and so on. So those are some thoughts from me. Who'd like to go next? Cara, do you want to say something?
I can just say that Jonathan did teach a class. Wow, it was many years ago now.
That's right.
In the college that was kind of like that, where we looked at some texts of various kinds, Swedenborg
Right.
Old and New, Swedenborg pre-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. That was a very mind-blowing class. So I'm all about your idea, Jonathan. Go,
Good.
go.
I love that class. I think that was about the year 2000, something like that. So yeah.
That was a long
How
time
about
ago.
Alicia?
Yeah, well, my personality type is such that I tend to like to go to the root of whatever the subject matter is, kind of, for better and for worse. Like I just tend to sort of do that. And it's a little bit of a, getting trapped in the perfectionist sort of thing. Because then, I often will set something else aside, realizing there's yet something underneath that. And then, the perpetual like, oh, but then there's something else. Oh, but then there's something else, and not quite completing on my way down. So I am happy to say that I did do a 500-day streak on Duolingo of Latin.
Wow.
Which, of course, there's a few caveats in there because they give you streak freeze here and there when you like space out or, whatever. But nevertheless, and some of those days were literally like 2 minutes and some of them were 10 minutes, and probably on average about 3.5 minutes. But yeah, so I did that. And then I conscientiously stopped that at 500 days because I felt like I just needed to pause, take a breath and sort of reassess. I do have somewhere around here, I have Winnie Ilipu because I thought, oh, this would be a good beginning. And yeah, just like Chelsea said, Latin enthusiast. And so I do like this idea of a passage and just kind of getting into a passage, in part because I did watch some lectures in Latin from the great courses with this instructor who was pretty fun. My challenge with that, and with most books I've run across on Latin, is that I don't have a good basis in the structure of language and words that are supposed to, like a declension and a this and a that. And so I really have to pause with English before I can even get to the Latin to be like, wait a minute, what's what's an appositive? I have no idea. So I
Right.
get stumbled, tripped up by those things. And when I watched those great courses, lectures on Latin, at least a first handful of them, what I really appreciated was the instructor started out with a passage from Genesis. And in principio, priavat Deus, and I was like, ooh, that's cool. And so that has stuck with me. And it's been a little bit of a tool, even going through my Duolingo. Oh, I actually really started though with Dinolingo. Which is for children, and it's little cartoons of dinosaurs walking around saying "Awe, Awe," and then Camilo Pardales is I think a giraffe, and like Cuniculus is a bunny. I learned all these miscellaneous words of animals. Really useful.
Oh
I
my
saw a Cuniculus the other day. I was like, "Awe, Cuniculus."
God. That is so different than learning in Caesar's Gallic Wars.
Yeah.
That's the Latin
Right.
framework I learned it. So
Thank you. That's great, Felicia. Very interesting. And Ray, go.
Well, I'm really excited to be working here. And then when I found out that you were translating things from Latin, I felt even more fulfilled, because I took 2 years of Latin in college. We did WheeLox. I've done the whole WheeLock Latin course. And it's been like 20 years. So I haven't really touched it since. I'm really looking forward to learning some more vocabulary. And I had no idea there was such a thing as NeoLatin. So I'm like super excited about it because, I studied classical Latin and I'm a librarian, and my big dream was to work with medieval manuscripts. And I thought that's where it ended for me. I thought that's where my Latin would end. And then I find out there's like this whole new era of Latin. And so I'm really excited to learn more about that. And what really interests me is I'm also a Swedenborg newbie, so I don't know a whole lot about Swedenborg's ideas. But I'm excited to learn about the original Latin because I know there's so much within Latin and how word order doesn't matter, how words can be, really jumbled up, and kind of it can be very poetic and very beautiful way to convey an idea. So I want to get at some of that. And then I don't even know what part of speech it is or what it is, but it's some type of thing in Latin where we don't really talk that or think that way in English or talk that way in English. You probably can name the thing I'm talking about, but I was always really interested, if we had access to that kind of speech and language, would my life be radically different? Would our lives be radically different if we could think in different ways, different future? Maybe it's this subjunct, I'm not sure what it is, but it's like a certain way of like phrasing a sentence that's not so concrete, which is kind of like we're kind of trapped in this really concrete way of expressing ourselves in English, I think. So, and that's what got me into really liking Latin and languages in general, although I haven't studied any other languages. I've tried to pick up Spanish, but it takes so much discipline. Like the 500-day streak, I'm like so impressed by that because I tried to do that with Spanish, but I just think there's a lot to learn about a culture and about different ways of thinking. with different languages, and then tying that in with Swedenborg ideas, which I don't know a whole lot about. I just thought it'd be a good way to dive in.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, I
I
want
love
to
that.
share a couple of thoughts in response to all that. I feel like I'm struck by what you were saying, Felicia, about it's so memorable when you have that particular experience of Genesis or something like whatever. And it's like that, I think that's true that we learn so much more, it stays with us. And that's what I would sort of hope we might, or I think that potential is in doing a podcast like this. And I think with what you're saying, Ray, that like the Swedenborg Foundation is, you know, you're somebody who actually studied Latin in college and you didn't learn about NeoLatin. You know, talk about a need, and just from a cultural, you know, like knowledge base to that the Swedenborg Foundation through a podcast like this or whatever could be helping people learn about this huge thing that is NeoLatin, that has a huge resource of material that can be explored. One of those things is Swedenborg's writings. And like, you know, we're kind of doing a service to the world by kind of resurrecting and for like continuing to hold this interest in Neo-Latin, and then the time period that it was most used in. I think about, I hope that we're kind of promoting or sending out that call, you know, like a signal into the universe of like, do you have a passion about Latin? Did you know that Neo-Latin exists? Are you interested in spirituality? Did you know that Swedenborg was this mystic who wrote in Neo-Latin about these amazing spiritual concepts that are very much, you know, relevant to modern exploration of society in all kinds of different levels? Like, be in touch with us at the Swedenborg Foundation. You know, we want to connect with you. And yeah, I'm excited to see how this evolves. So I wanted to share those quick thoughts. But Jonathan.
Great. I love it. One thing that comes to mind is that in ancient Rome, quote unquote, college was just going to Greece. Like you just go to another country with a different language. That's what, I mean, it was a heck of a country with an amazing culture and art and history and everything, but that was college. Just go to a different country. That was it. And Swedenborg says at one point, you know, Swedenborg's pretty big on the idea of religion. He thinks a lot of people get things wrong about religion, but he's very devoted to religion. It's fascinating that he says that Germany at the time, and I've found this out independently from history as well, was very divided into these little duchies. And it was, what was it? Cuius regio, alias religio, something like that. Whoever's region it is, it's that person's religion. So if the Duke is Catholic, you're Catholic.
Oh,
Lutheran, you know, so very subdivided. So Swedenborg's like, wow, ooh, especially in those days, Catholic and Protestant, like that was a divide you couldn't even bridge. So it's very interesting to me that he says that about the German people, that they are all together in the same place in the spiritual world. And you probably know this idea that Swedenborg says that that's actually a map of our minds. Like if you're feeling down, you're actually down in that world, you know, kind of thing. You know, if you're feeling lifted up, you know, you're actually in a higher place. German people are all together because of a common language. In other words, language even supersedes religion as something to unite people and something that enables the way that you think. You think differently. I'll give you one simple example from ancient Greek, which really blew my mind, that to us, the whole way we map it with prepositions and everything, time is up ahead. Carl's probably heard me give this example before. Time is ahead. That's up ahead. That's behind me now. That's in the past. To the ancient Greeks, they traveled the opposite way. The past was in front of them because they could see it. The future was behind them because they couldn't see it. How amazing is that? To think of everything about the way you use prepositions is that they see themselves as moving the opposite way through space and time than we do. I think that
Wow.
kind of thing is just amazing. So I think language really is a great thing. And even just having a couple of years or whatever, it starts to expand. You start to realize, well, wait, my own language is pretty weird, actually. And there are things that are weird. There are strengths and weaknesses about English, strengths and weaknesses about Latin, and all these different languages do different things, and it's fascinating. And I've been really struck lately by how much they persist. I've been listening to a podcast that absolutely love called The History of English.
Mm.
It's like up to 180 episodes, an hour long or something like that. And it gets way into the weeds of all these spellings. Like I'll give you an example he just gave the other day. So we have all these W words, don't we? Who, what, where, when, why, which, all those sorts of words. I didn't think about until I listened to this episode the other day that I know they start with WH. So the H is not pronounced unless you have an O, in which case you only pronounce the H and you don't pronounce the W. It should be whoa. It should be who, I mean, it should be when, where, why, what, whoa, right? Why, you know? Well, what's amazing is that some of these things, not that particular one, that only goes back to like the 1500s or something, but some of these things are thousands of years old. Generations and generations have lived and died, and we still have an A in that word.
Mm.
And even if nobody knew why, it's there for a reason. Like there's something quite mystical about language, I think.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of the New Testament statement that Jesus says that heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. And Genesis, everything's created by language. So, wow, that really, you think of language, this little ephemeral thing, these little kids come into the world and they're making mistakes, you know, saying crazy things that nobody said before. And think, wow, this thing would just blow away in a strong storm. And yet it outlives us all vastly. There's something huge about it. So I think language is great. And another thing I think is that it would be hard to articulate this, but as you may know, Swedenborg's very fond of the idea of the human form. Basically, in his mind, everything's really in the human form. There's kind of a humanity to everything. And if you get a group of people together, they will function like one person. And we even say that in common parlance, that so-and-so is the brains of the outfit, or, you know, so-and-so is the boots on the ground, you know, like get things done kind of thing. And he says that even of individual thoughts and feelings, that if you look at our individual thoughts and feelings, they're in a complete human form. So one of the things that happened to him as he was doing his spiritual transition was that his thoughts scared each other. Like one thought scared another thought. And I don't think he thought up until that point that that could happen, but somehow, what was that? What just happened? You know, but the mind is more multifarious than we think. And I've extended that to the thought about language, and I can't prove it, but words are together. All the words in a sentence, they're there, they're at the party with somebody, is the way that I often think about it. All those words, they're there with somebody. They might not tell you who they're with. And in Latin, you raise the question of word order. They may be at opposite ends of the sentence. They're still, you can't tell, because, you know, this one's over there eating the cashews and this one's in the other room looking at the artwork or something. You don't know. They came to the party together. You could, and in Latin, you can really tell. One of the features of Latin that is so fascinating to me, this was true of Old English, which they're descended from a common Indo-European root, was Old English was an inflected language. Modern English doesn't have much inflection anymore, meaning how you swap out endings and they have different meanings. So we put an ed on the end of something, now it's past tense, or and so on. Latin does that a lot, as you know. And what struck me about that is that in English, we work very much. What took the place of inflection over time in English, as you shifted into modern English, was word order. And word order is absolutely vital, you know. They say about the newspaper headline, "Man bites dog." You know, that only goes one way. You know, it's not interchangeable. And that's a news story when it goes that way around. And in Latin, you can put the man and the dog anywhere you want in the verb. And as a result, what happens as a result of that is that Latin can express tone of voice. Like the problem with texting, people don't necessarily know which word you're emphasizing, and often it's not even punctuated or whatever, right? Things can mean quite different things. I read something funny the other day about this boss who seems very hostile because he uses periods at the end of his text messages, and it just seems such something.
No.
Nice
That's a
job.
new
Period. Oh, what you know.
Oh my
Um,
gosh, that's new.
so Latin can do tone of voice because it can drag a word. It has the flexibility to drag a word up front of the sentence or make it last. Those are sort of hot spots in the sentence if you pull it early or pull it late. Sometimes Swedenborg sentences remind me of a little breathless kid who will come in and say, Jody, I was riding my bike home and I saw this cat on the path, and then I saw a bike and it was Jody's. Well, you know, Jody was stated first because that's going to become important. And sometimes Swedenborg sentences do that. Like you get Jody first, even though it's not the subject or the verb or the object, you know. But okay, let's get our topic up front because Latin can do that, and little kids do that. Little kids are actually linguistic geniuses. They've found out. This is just a little side note, but I was fascinated by this. That if you have, they've studied this. There've been situations where you have a husband and wife who both went deaf as adults and learned how to do American Sign Language as adults, and they don't do it very well. Their grammar's not right because it's like learning any language as an adult. You know, you're not as hardwired for it. And if they live in isolation from any other deaf people, their kid will do it correctly. That kid will correct their grammar. The kid knows what the grammar should be and will impose correct grammar on the flawed language of the only two people they know who are speaking that language. There's very interesting studies that have been done about this.
Wow.
Steven Pinker wrote a book a few years ago, Harvard professor, called The Language Instinct, that was about the idea that we're kind of hardwired for language. And the only thing a kid really needs to know is it head first or tail first? Which way around does your language go? You know, Japanese
Wow.
is one way and English is another way. And then, okay, I'm ready. Blah, 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 feed me information.
I want to just interject here, and but I don't want you to lose your train of thought. If you had one. No, just like I feel like so what we've learned is inflection, a very basic thing that means having endings that can make words mean different things. There's a little bit of that in English. It's a lot in Latin.
Yes.
But then the second main thing is this whole where words are lends itself to tone in terms of a sentence. So you're learning where you put the words adds a certain energy to what you're saying. I mean, I guess we do that a little bit in English too, but there's like more of that in Latin. And
there's more of that.
And I totally hear what you're saying about how the way kids talk. And it's a little bit hard for grownups to like, okay, but you know, or like just tell me the story or something. But they're they're putting things up front that maybe wasn't there.
Yes, and how far apart two words that belong together, which Swedenborg doesn't do as much as the classical Latin authors. But if you want to emphasize something, you can.
Oh,
you know, that's a
stretch it out. Yeah.
Bothersome, heck of a frustrating, I'm never going to get over this day. You know, if you separate bothersome and day, you're really emphasizing, you know, If you just had a bothersome day, which had a lot of trouble in it, it's not quite as
Yes.
German will do that, right? You drag two words apart to stuff a whole bunch of subordinate clauses in between there.
Okay.
Yes, and so word order absolutely matters, but because inflection can do the job of telling you when you go into the party, you go, okay, whose party is this? Who's the subject? Who's the verb? Who's the object? The inflection, the word endings can tell you.
That's a wrap on the fun of the Latin Playground for now, a production of the Swedenborg Foundation. As a nonprofit, the Swedenborg Foundation depends on the generous giving of donors who find value in the spiritual ideas we've explored here today. Without Latin translation, we wouldn't be able to share what Swedenborg wrote about, and without the funds necessary to financially support Latin translation, we wouldn't be in a position to even know what Swedenborg dedicated his life to putting down on paper in the first place. We need your help. Please consider making a donation to the Dr. Jonathan S. Rose Translation Fund at swedenborg.com/donate. But if you don't have the means at present, your support in the form of liking this podcast, writing a positive review, and sharing it with a friend is as real as cold, hard cash. We hope you'll continue to learn alongside us here on the Latin Playground.